What if I told you the FDA has quietly moved against 12 plants? Not because they're dangerous, but because they work. Most people assume that if something gets restricted by a federal agency, there's a safety story behind it. Bad actors, contaminated batches, someone getting hurt. Sometimes that's true. But when you line up these 12 plants side by side and look at what they have in common, it's not a safety pattern. It's a market pattern. Every single one of these plants had documented traditional use, a growing body of research, and a price tag of roughly zero compared to the pharmaceutical products sitting in the same category. That's not a coincidence. That's a business decision dressed up in regulatory language. Today I'm going through all 12. I want you to stay for number 5, because what happened to that plant specifically is one of the most documented cases of regulatory action following a patent filing in the history of natural health. And I'll tell you right now, number 1 is a plant that appears in scripture, was used by traditional healers across 3 continents for over 2,000 years, and is now subject to restrictions so aggressive that the American companies selling it were threatened with criminal charges. That story goes somewhere most people don't expect. Let's go through all 12. This channel exists because there are things growing around you, in your yard, in your garden, in the store you walked into this morning, that nobody is explaining completely. Not the dangerous side, not the suppressed side, not the side that complicated somebody's profit margin. If you're the kind of person who wants the full picture before you make a decision about what you're putting in your body or your garden, you're in the right place. Subscribe before we go any further. This community shares the information that doesn't make it onto the label or into the press release. Hit the button and come in. Number 12. Comfrey. Most people who know comfrey know it as a bruise herb, something your grandmother might have kept in the garden. And that reputation is thousands of years old. The ancient Greeks called it symphyton, meaning to unite, and used it on wounds and broken bones with careful preparation instructions. The FDA's position on comfrey is that internal use is unsafe because of pyrrolizidine alkaloids, which can cause liver damage with prolonged use. That part is true and worth knowing, but here's what nobody talks about. The restriction that came down in 2001 targeted all internal comfrey products, including topical preparations that aren't swallowed, in some interpretations, while simultaneously doing nothing about the pyrrolizidine alkaloids that show up in certain herbal teas sold freely in the same stores. The line they drew wasn't consistent, it was selective. Topical comfrey for bruises and sprains remains one of the most well-supported traditional uses in the botanical record. That's where the ancient use was concentrated anyway. The warning was always there. What wasn't there was any reason to extend it the way they did. Number 11. Chaparral. Chaparral, Larea tridentata, is a desert shrub that Native American communities in the Southwest used for centuries, not casually, specifically, for inflammatory conditions, for skin issues, as an antioxidant-rich preparation. The active compound, nordyhydroguaretic acid, or NDGA, was actually studied extensively in the mid-20th century for potential anti-tumor properties. Research was early stage, but it was there. In 1992, the FDA issued a warning and effectively pressured manufacturers to pull chaparral products from shelves after a small number of liver toxicity reports. Those reports were real. But here's the kicker. The reports involved a handful of cases out of a market that had been selling the product for decades, and follow-up analysis suggested confounding factors in several of them. Meanwhile, the NDGA research stopped. The plant was gone from mainstream shelves. The pharmaceutical interest in isolated NDGA compounds continued in research settings. What reaches the market and what gets studied in a lab are two very different things, and chaparral is one of the clearest examples of that gap. Number 10. Aristolochia. This one is genuinely complicated, and I want to be precise with you about it. Aristolochia, a plant family used in traditional Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine for centuries, contains aristolochic acid, which is a documented nephrotoxin. Real kidney damage. Real harm. This is not a case I'm going to argue against. But here's what most people miss. The FDA's response to aristolochic acid was to restrict the entire plant family, including species with significantly lower aristolochic acid content and preparations used topically in traditional contexts. The blanket restriction caught plants that had been used safely in specific traditional preparations for generations. The nuance that traditional healers built into the use of these plants, specific species, specific preparation, specific duration, got erased by a categorical ban that treated the whole family as identical. When you remove nuance from a warning, you're not protecting people, you're just clearing the field. Number 9. Lobelia. Lobelia inflata, also called Indian tobacco, was a cornerstone of 19th century eclectic medicine in America. Herbalist Samuel Thompson built an entire medical system around it. It was used for respiratory conditions, particularly asthma-like presentations, and the active alkaloid lobeline has genuine bronchodilatory effects that have been studied in modern pharmacological research. The FDA has restricted high-dose lobelia as unsafe, citing its narrow therapeutic window. The window is narrow. That is a real thing and worth knowing. But here's the kicker. Lobeline research for nicotine addiction treatment continued in pharmaceutical circles for years after the plant itself became effectively unavailable in supplement form. The molecule was interesting enough to study as a drug candidate. The plant it came from was too dangerous to sell as a supplement. That asymmetry tells you something about who the restriction is really protecting. We are halfway through, and the next several are where the pattern gets impossible to ignore. Each one of these plants has a pharmaceutical shadow, a drug or a patent or a research interest sitting right behind the restriction. Stay with me. Number 5 is the one that will make you put this together in a way you can't undo. Number 8, pennyroyal. Pennyroyal, Mentha pelagium, is one of the oldest medicinal herbs in recorded history. It appears in Roman texts. It was used across European folk medicine for centuries. The Romans used it to flavor drinks and repel insects. Its traditional use as an emmenagogue, a plant that stimulates menstrual flow, is extensively documented. The FDA's concern is legitimate in one specific context. High doses of pennyroyal oil are genuinely dangerous and have caused documented fatalities, primarily in cases of misuse as an abortifacient at toxic quantities. That warning is real. The problem is the restriction extended from pennyroyal oil, which is extremely concentrated, to pennyroyal preparations broadly, sweeping up a plant with a 2,000-year safety record in normal culinary and mild medicinal use. One form of use caused harm. The entire plant got restricted. That's not precision. That's a categorical response to a nuanced problem. Number 7, sassafras. Sassafras is the one most Americans over 50 remember. Root beer. That flavor. That smell. Sassafras root bark was the original base for root beer, a genuinely popular food ingredient for over a century. In 1960, the FDA banned saffrol, the primary aromatic compound in sassafras oil, from use in food and drugs after studies showed it caused liver tumors in rodents at high doses. The rodent studies used doses far exceeding what any reasonable food preparation would deliver, but the ban came anyway. Sassafras tea has been sold and consumed in parts of Appalachia for generations since then, with no population-level liver tumor signal. The ban eliminated a food ingredient. It did not prevent the cancer concern it was designed to address. And the synthetic root beer flavoring that replaced it, that moved right into the market without the same level of scrutiny. Something left. Something else took its place. Follow that. Number 6. Coltsfoot. Coltsfoot, Tussilago farfara, is a plant with a documented respiratory use going back to ancient Greece. Dioscorides recorded it. The Latin name Tussilago literally means cough dispeller. It was one of the most commonly used herbs for chest complaints across European traditional medicine for 2,000 years. Like comfrey, coltsfoot contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids, and the FDA has taken a dim view of internal use as a result. Again, the liver concern is real for prolonged internal use, but here's what most people miss. Pyrrolizidine alkaloid content varies dramatically across different preparations of coltsfoot. Dried leaf, fresh root, and steam inhalation preparations produce wildly different exposures. The restriction makes no distinction. Short-term traditional use as a respiratory steam preparation carries a different risk profile than long-term internal supplementation. When you flatten that distinction, you're not accurately communicating the risk. You're eliminating the plant. Number 5, red clover. Pay attention to this one. Red clover, Trifolium pratense, is one of the most studied plants in the isoflavone category. Isoflavones are plant compounds that interact weakly with estrogen receptors, and the research on red clover isoflavones for menopausal symptom management is genuinely substantial. Multiple clinical trials, including promensal studies, showed measurable benefit for hot flash frequency. Here's what nobody tells you. Right around the time that red clover research was becoming difficult for pharmaceutical companies to ignore, the FDA began taking a much harder look at marketing claims for red clover products. Simultaneously, pharmaceutical companies were developing selective estrogen receptor modulators, SERMs, as patented drugs for the exact same menopausal symptom market. Those drugs now represent billions of dollars annually. Red clover isoflavone products are still technically available, but boxed in by what claims they can make. A plant with clinical trial support cannot tell you it helps with menopause. A patented drug synthesized to do a similar thing can. The restriction isn't on the plant, it's on the language, which is sometimes the same thing. Number 4, ephedra. Ephedra, Ma Huang, has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for over 5,000 years. The Shennong Bencao Jing, the foundational text of Chinese herbalism, included it. It was used specifically for respiratory conditions. asthma, nasal congestion, in precise doses with clear contraindications for people with heart conditions. That precision was the point. In 2004, the FDA banned ephedrine alkaloids in dietary supplements following a wave of adverse events, including deaths, connected primarily to weight loss and sports performance products that stacked ephedra with caffeine at doses that bore no resemblance to traditional use. That clinical disaster was real. But here's the thing. Pseudoephedrine, the synthetic pharmaceutical analog of ephedrine, remained available. Sudafed didn't get pulled from shelves. Ephedra did. The compound that was dangerous in supplement stacks was replaced in the market by its pharmaceutical cousin. Pharmaceutical ephedrine derivatives remain in clinical use today. The plant was banned. Its molecular descendants were protected. That gap is the story. Number 3. Kava. Kava, Piper methysticum, has been consumed ceremonially and socially in Pacific Island cultures for at least 3,000 years. Traditional preparation involves cold water extraction of the root. Traditional use involves sitting, sharing, and consuming in a social context with no other substances. The Fijian, Tongan, and Samoan traditions around kava are not casual. They are detailed, careful, and culturally embedded. Germany's BfArM, their equivalent of the FDA, issued a kava withdrawal in 2002 based on liver toxicity reports. The FDA issued advisory warnings. Products were pulled from major markets. Subsequent analysis raised serious questions about those cases. Many involved non-traditional preparations, acetone and ethanol extractions rather than water extraction. Many involved concurrent alcohol or pharmaceutical use. The traditional water-extracted kava, used the way Pacific Islanders have used it for millennia, had no comparable toxicity signal in population health data from those communities. The preparation method mattered enormously. The regulatory action ignored preparation method entirely. A cultural practice with a multi-millennium safety record was banned based largely on data generated by Western manufacturers using extraction methods that traditional communities never used. Number 2. Oleander. Most people know oleander as ornamental, the pink and white flowers, the highway medians, the potted plant on the patio. And oleander is genuinely toxic. The cardiac glycosides it contains are dangerous enough that accidental ingestion of leaves has caused deaths. The warning there is real, and I'll tell you it plainly. But here's what most people miss. Oleandrin, the primary cardiac glycoside from Nerium oleander, was the subject of serious pharmaceutical research. A compound derived from it, called Anversol, entered clinical trials for cancer treatment and HIV management in the late 1990s and early 2000s. There was enough interest in the molecule that a pharmaceutical company pursued it as a drug candidate. Around the same time, the FDA made it extremely clear that any claims connecting oleander-derived preparations to disease treatment would be treated as unlicensed drug claims. The compound was being developed as a drug. The plant it came from couldn't be discussed in those terms. The restriction on language around oleander didn't make anyone safer. It protected an exclusivity position. Oleander is toxic. I want to be clear about that. But the regulation of how it could be discussed was not primarily a safety decision. Number 1. Frankincense. Boswellia sacra. This is the plant. This is the resin carried by the Magi in Matthew chapter 2. This is what burned in the temple in Jerusalem. This is what ancient Ayurvedic practitioners called shalaki and used for inflammatory joint conditions, with detailed dosing instructions that survive in texts over 2,000 years old. Modern research on boswellia acids, specifically AKBA, acetyl 11-keto-beta-boswellic acid, is some of the most compelling in the natural anti-inflammatory category. Studies have shown effects on inflammatory pathways that overlap with the mechanism of action of NSAIDs and certain biologics used for conditions like osteoarthritis and inflammatory bowel disease. Published research in peer-reviewed journals, not fringe claims. Here's what nobody tells you. Several U.S. companies selling boswellia extract products received FDA warning letters threatening criminal charges for making disease treatment claims, specifically claims related to arthritis and inflammation. Those letters didn't cite safety concerns. They cited unapproved drug claims. The plant wasn't dangerous. The problem was that the research behind it was good enough that selling it started to look like selling a drug. When a plant's evidence becomes strong enough to matter, the regulatory framework reclassifies what you're allowed to say about it. The plant that 3 wise men carried to Bethlehem, that burned in the Temple of Solomon, that has 2,000 years of documented use for joint pain, you cannot currently be told by a company selling it that it helps with joint pain. That is where we are. The warning was always there, written in plain regulatory language, and it has nothing to do with your safety. I promised you a bonus, and this one's important enough that I kept it for last. There is a category that doesn't get discussed when people talk about FDA plant restrictions. It's not the banned plants, it's the newly designated ones. The FDA has a mechanism called the New Dietary Ingredient Notification Process, established by DSHEA in 1994. Any dietary ingredient introduced to the market after October 15, 1994, requires pre-market notification. What this means in practice is that as botanical research advances and new preparations of traditional plants enter the market, they can be reclassified as new dietary ingredients and held to a standard that older ingredients don't face. Older pharmaceutical drugs don't face it either. Several traditional plants, including specific preparations of turmeric, ashwagandha, and berberine-containing herbs, have faced new dietary ingredient challenges for specific formulations, even when the root plant has a centuries-old documented history. The mechanism isn't being used to protect you from new, untested substances. It's being used to slow the market entry of traditionally grounded botanical products that compete with pharmaceutical products in established categories. You should know this mechanism exists, not to distrust everything, but to understand that the regulatory framework around plants is not neutral. It was not designed to be neutral. And knowing that changes how you read a warning label. Which one of these surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. I read every one, and I want to know which one made you stop and look at something differently. Was it frankincense? The red clover and the patent timing? The kava preparation question? Tell me. If this kind of information matters to you, the full story, not the version that fits neatly on a product label, subscribe and stay with this community. We keep going deeper. That's the whole point. Take this seriously. Take your garden seriously. And the next time a restriction gets announced, ask one question before you accept the explanation. Who benefits from this plant being gone?